The humid Georgia air hung heavy, a thick, cloying blanket that clung to everything, especially the simmering rage in my chest. I'd just pulled up to my mother's modest, single-story house in Oakwood Estates, a meticulously manicured community where every blade of grass seemed to be held accountable. And there, stark and imposing, was a brand-new 6-foot-tall, vinyl fence encircling her entire property. It was a sterile, unforgiving white, a stark contrast to the vibrant azaleas and the weathered charm of Mom's lovingly tended garden. My mother, bless her heart, had always been a private person, content with her quiet life and her flourishing roses. But this was an invasion, a declaration of war. And I knew exactly who was responsible. Patricia Cline, the self-appointed queen of Oakwood Estates, the HOA president with a penchant for pearl necklaces and a reputation for wielding her power like a rusty broadsword. I wasn't a regular visitor to Oakwood Estates. I lived a life far removed from the manicured lawns and the meticulously enforced regulations. My world was one of high-stakes deals, private jets, and the constant hum of global business. I was a self-made man, a multimillionaire who had clawed his way to the top from humble beginnings. And while I indulged in the luxuries my success afforded me, I never forgot where I came from. My mother, her unwavering support, her unwavering belief in me, was the cornerstone of my existence. The anger coursing through me wasn't just about the fence. It was about the audacity, the sheer arrogance of Patricia Cline and her ilk. They saw my mother as a quaint, harmless old lady, a relic in their pristine, sterile world. They didn't know me. They didn't know the fire that burned within me, the unwavering determination to protect those I loved. I parked my sleek black SUV, a vehicle that stood out like a sore thumb in the sea of sensible sedans and minivans, and strode towards the house. My mother, a small, frail woman with eyes that still sparkled with youthful mischief, was sitting on her porch swing, a bewildered expression on her face. "Mom, what's going on?" I asked, my voice a low growl. "Oh, darling, you're here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's this fence. Mrs. Cline said it was necessary." "Necessary for what?" I demanded. "Something about property values," she mumbled, her gaze fixed on the sterile white barrier. And the bushes. She said they were overgrown. I clenched my fists. My mother's bushes were her pride and joy, a riot of color and fragrance that had been carefully cultivated over decades. And Patricia Cline, with her manicured nails and her condescending smile, had deemed them overgrown. "Don't worry, Mom," I said, my voice softening. "I'll take care of this." I knew I was entering a battleground. Oakwood Estates was Patricia Cline's domain, her kingdom. She ruled with an iron fist, enforcing the minutiae of the HOA bylaws with the zeal of a zealot. And she had a loyal army of busybodies and sycophants who were only too eager to do her bidding. I decided to start with a direct approach. I walked to Patricia Cline's house, a sprawling 2-story mansion with perfectly manicured hedges and a meticulously curated rose garden. I rang the doorbell, and after a moment the door swung open, revealing Patricia Cline, a woman with a tightly wound bun, a pinched expression, and a string of pearls that looked like they could choke a rhino. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "I'm Jonathan Thorne," I said, extending my hand. "Margaret Thorne's son." Her eyes narrowed. "Oh yes, the son who lives elsewhere." "I'm here about the fence," I said, cutting to the chase. "I'd like to know why you decided to erect a fence around my mother's property without her consent." "It was a decision made by the HOA board," she said, her voice clipped. "It was necessary to maintain the aesthetic standards of the community." "Aesthetic standards?" I scoffed. "You're talking about a sterile, white fence that looks like it belongs in a prison yard." My mother's garden was beautiful. It was a testament to her love and her hard work. "The bushes were overgrown," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "They were attracting pests." "Pests?" I raised an eyebrow. "Or were they attracting your disapproval?" She flushed. "That's enough. I'm not going to stand here and be insulted. The fence is staying. It's for the good of the community." "The good of the community?" I echoed, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or the good of Patricia Cline's ego?" She slammed the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, the echo of the slamming door reverberating in the quiet street. I knew then that this wasn't going to be a simple negotiation. Patricia Cline was determined to assert her authority, and I was equally determined to protect my mother. I returned to my mother's house, my mind racing. I needed a strategy. I couldn't simply bulldoze my way through this. I needed to play the game, but on my terms. I started by researching the Oakwood Estates HOA bylaws. I spent hours poring over the documents, searching for loopholes, for any leverage I could find. I discovered that the HOA bylaws were a labyrinth of rules and regulations, but they were also riddled with ambiguities and inconsistencies. I also started talking to my mother's neighbors. I wanted to understand the dynamics of the community, to gauge the level of support for Patricia Cline. What I found was a mixture of fear, resentment, and a quiet admiration for my mother's resilience. Many of them had been intimidated by Patricia Cline's bullying tactics, but they were also secretly hoping that someone would stand up to her. I decided to use my resources. I hired a team of lawyers, experts in HOA law, to analyze the bylaws and identify any violations. I also hired a public relations firm to manage the narrative, to ensure that the story was told from my perspective. I started by sending a letter to the HOA board, demanding the removal of the fence. I cited specific violations of the bylaws, including the lack of proper notice and the arbitrary nature of the decision. I also included a copy of a petition signed by several of my mother's neighbors, expressing their support for her. Patricia Cline responded with a letter of her own, filled with legal jargon and thinly veiled threats. She accused me of harassment and intimidation, and she reiterated her determination to uphold the aesthetic standards of the community. The battle was on. I decided to take the fight to the media. I gave interviews to local news outlets, exposing Patricia Cline's bullying tactics and the arbitrary nature of the HOA's decisions. I painted a picture of a community where one woman wielded unchecked power, where the voices of ordinary residents were silenced. The story resonated with the public. People were tired of HOAs that acted like dictators, that imposed unreasonable rules and regulations. They were tired of bullies who used their power to intimidate and control. The media attention put pressure on the HOA board. Some members began to waver, to question Patricia Cline's leadership. They were worried about the negative publicity, about the potential for legal action. I also started to use my financial resources. I offered to pay for the removal of the fence and the restoration of my mother's garden. I also offered to pay for a community meeting where residents could voice their concerns about the HOA. Patricia Cline tried to fight back. She accused me of trying to buy my way out of the situation, of trying to undermine the authority of the HOA. But her words fell on deaf ears. The tide had turned. The community meeting was a turning point. Residents stood up and spoke out against Patricia Cline's bullying tactics. They shared stories of intimidation, of arbitrary fines, of petty rules that had made their lives miserable. Patricia Cline was cornered. She tried to defend herself, but her voice was drowned out by the chorus of voices demanding change. The HOA board voted to remove the fence and to revise the bylaws. They also voted to hold new elections for the board, effectively stripping Patricia Cline of her power. My mother's garden was restored to its former glory. The fence was torn down, and the sterile white barrier was replaced by a vibrant tapestry of flowers and foliage. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief. Patricia Cline, her power stripped away, her reputation tarnished, retreated into her mansion, a symbol of her defeated ambition. I had won. I had protected my mother, and I had stood up to a bully. But the victory wasn't just about me. It was about the power of community, the power of ordinary people to stand up to injustice. I learned a valuable lesson in Oakwood Estates. Money and power could open doors, but they couldn't buy respect. True power came from integrity, from standing up for what was right, from protecting those you loved. And sometimes, even a multimillionaire needs to remind the neighborhood that family matters above all else.